Okay, that's the Constitution. And what it sets out was who gets what power. Well, who gets to exercise it? Who gets to make the law? The legislature or parliament. So, legislative power is the power to make the law, and we can see that that resides in the federal parliament and the various state and territory parliaments. What's their structure? Well, you can have a look at this slide, and what you really see there is most parliaments have two houses, a Crown representative and a leader of the parliament. So the Crown representative from our heritage, the British Parliament, is the Queen, the upper house, the House of Lords, the lower house, the House of Commons, and the leader is the Prime Minister. Now, our structure is a bit different in the UK and in the British Parliament. The House of Lords actually get their hereditary. It goes back to medieval times. House of Commons is where everyone's elected. Now, in Australia, in the federal parliament, we have the Queen's representative, who's the Governor General. The upper house is the Senate, and the senators actually come from each of the states. The lower house, the House of Representatives, is where we vote for a member for our local area, and the leader in the federal parliament is the Prime Minister. State, rather than having a Governor General, we have a Governor. They hold the same kind of position, appointed by the Queen on recommendation of the government. The upper house is a legislative council. Asterisk that, particularly for Queensland, we'll come back to whether or not we have a legislative council. A lower house is called the Legislative Assembly, and the leader is called the Premier. Territory, I'll leave you to read. That's like the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory. So that's a structure. We have a Crown representative, two houses, upper and lower, and a leader. So what this represents, having two houses, is a bicameral structure, upper and lower house. It's kind of like having a check and balance, although not every parliament has an upper and lower house. You saw that some of the territories only had one. They're unicameral, and that means we've only got the one house. Queensland, unicameral. We don't actually have an upper house. It was abolished in 1922, so we only have the one, the Legislative Assembly, as we can see from this structure. We don't have a Legislative Council in Queensland. Federal Parliament, in the lower house, that's called the House of Representatives. It's called the People's House because there's equal representation based upon the number of people in Australia. There's roughly about 150 electorates with roughly equal numbers of voters in each electorate to elect someone. The political party with the most people in the House of Representatives, they form the executive government, and the Prime Minister is traditionally, or not necessarily, but I think it always will be, it's a very strong tradition, is a member of the lower house. The upper house is called the Senate, and what we have is, rather than it representing the number of people, like the lower house, so if you think about it, states with a lot more people will have a lot more seats in the lower house, but in the upper house, the seats for each state are the same, and it's called the States House for that reason. It was meant as a check and balance so that the interests of the states couldn't be overridden by the most populous people in a couple of states, because they'd have most of the members of the House of Representatives, right? So what they did was they said each of the states get the same number of senators. So if you were voting in for the federal election in Queensland, what you'd find is that you vote for your local member, and then you also vote for the senators. And we get half of the senators get elected each time, so we'd be voting for 6 Senate positions. Overall, we have 76 senators versus 150 in the lower house. In Queensland, as we've said, we only have that one house, the upper house, the lower house, sorry, the Legislative Assembly. The upper house was abolished in 1922. In Parliament, the Crown is represented by the Governor General, at the federal level and at the state level by governors. A bill doesn't become law until that person, the Governor General or the Governor, signs it. The relevant Crown representative must give it what's called royal assent. How does Parliament actually make a bill? Well, you get a proposal from all different areas. Here's some of the areas it can come from, right? So you can look at this slide and see that we can get stuff coming in from the courts, from media, from law reform bodies, from government policy, lobby groups, public servants. Lots of ideas come, say, look, we should have a new law. So once you got that proposal and the government says, yes, we want to make a bill, or even a private member can introduce a bill, but someone needs to draft it. Now, the drafting of that bill, that is actually done by a special area of government called the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. There's some government lawyers, and that's what they do for a living, draft legislation. As part of that, they also produce something called an explanatory memorandum. And what that does is that sets out the law and what each of the provisions are actually meant to do. Okay, so we've drafted it, we've got our explanation. What do? It goes to the lower house. Following going to the lower house, if it gets through there, it'll go to the upper house. So if it was in the federal parliament, it would go to the House of Representatives. If it got through there, through its 3 readings, it would go to the Senate. It would get through 3 readings there. Then the Governor-General signs it, gives it Royals assent, and it commences. Okay, so we've got this idea. We have the proposal, we draft it into a bill, it goes to a house. What actually happens in the Houses of Parliament? And that's set out in this slide here. And we can see that there are 4 key steps involving 3 readings. So, what do these readings actually mean? Okay, well, the first reading is really more of a ceremonial reading. In that first reading, what we find actually happens is a formal So what actually happens in one of the Houses of Parliament, what we see is that there's 4 key stages involving 3 readings. In the first reading, really the clerk of the House, who's a government employee, will stand up and read the title of the bill. No one's debating it. It's really just that they're circulating the bill so everyone gets a chance to have a look at it, and they set a date for when they're going to have the second reading. Now this second reading is the main one. That begins, and the minister who's in charge of the area will stand up and talk about what the bill is, and it's going to outline what it should do, what its objectives are. When that minister's finished, the proceedings usually are adjourned, so everyone goes away for a little while to consider the bill, and they're given those documents that were prepared earlier by the special drafters. They're given the explanatory memorandum to help them try and understand it. Then the House comes back together, and the members can then debate the bill and they vote on it again. At the next stage, we look at whether we're going to go into more depth to actually understand the bill, and that can go 2 ways. At the committee stage, the bill can go to what they call the Committee of the Whole, so it can go to the whole Parliament again, and they'll have a more detailed examination of all the clauses of the bill. But you can imagine that would gum up Parliament if they had to go through every provision of every bill for everything that they did. So instead, sometimes it gets referred to a committee. They can be called a select or a standing committee. All that means is that there's a subgroup, generally made up of both political parties or all political parties, controlled by the government, and they look in more detail at the bill. That committee will then send it back to the House. They'll advise the House about what they think should happen. And that goes back for the third reading. Again, at the third reading, there's not a lot of debate. It's very restricted. And if there's a motion passed, and that generally happens when the government controls the vote, there'll be a motion passed that the bill be read a 3rd time. And then the clerk again reads the title of the bill, and then it's successfully passed through that House. Now those stages, as we've seen, happen at both the upper house and the lower house. Quite a complex way to examine whether the law should actually be passed. Okay, so now that now it's been through both houses, we actually need to get royal assent. That is largely ceremonial, where the Crown representative, the Governor-General for the federal parliament, or the governor for the state parliament will actually sign it on the advice of the executive government. The final thing to think about in Parliament is what happens if there's a deadlock? Okay, what happens if the lower house passes it, but then just say the government doesn't control the upper house, they don't have enough votes in the upper house, which is what we have at the moment. Well, then what happens is we got a deadlock. And so under section 57 of the Constitution, if the upper house doesn't pass a bill passed by the lower house, and then 3 months later, it's passed by the lower house and not passed by the upper house again, so it's rejected twice, what we find is that the Governor-General can dissolve both houses of Parliament. So no, you've got to go to an election for everyone. And that does happen. That's called a double dissolution. If after that there's still a deadlock, the Governor-General can call everyone together and there's one vote of both the upper and lower house. And generally, the lower house has more numbers, and so the majority in the lower house will actually win that vote. Double dissolutions are relatively rare, and these deadlocks following a double dissolution are even rarer. Okay, so that's a bit of an idea around how we make laws, both the legislature and the process involved.